Okay guys, welcome back to episode number 3 of the Performance Enhancing Drug series. This is going to be our first dive into a compound, and we are going to start off with testosterone, obviously. Testosterone being the root androgen, it is obviously the hormone that all other compounds are derived from. It is the main male sex hormone, and it's also what I believe to be the best in terms of a first cycle. So if you're going to take a route down the enhanced route, or going to go down the enhanced route, probably sounds better, I would always recommend, at least in most cases, to start off with the testosterone. And because of that, it suits the role of being the first compound that we're going to cover. Now, testosterone has many, many roles and responsibilities in the body, and among others, it will have impacts downstream on things like growth hormone, it will increase protein synthesis, and as I say, these, among others, are where the interests from bodybuilders, powerlifters, and sports performers really come into play. Now, before enrolling on any sort of performance enhancement or any other form of recreational compound that you wish to supplement, I would always recommend starting with a blood test. And the reason for this is because it's going to give us an understanding of where we are and whether or not this is going to be an even remotely sensible decision, or whether it's something that we should avoid. And it can also allow us to potentially manipulate our stack design to favour the state of our blood work as it is before we start, if that makes sense. So it's really, really important that we get one done. And in order to get a blood test done, I personally recommend MediChecks. I don't have a preference on MediChecks over any others. I just haven't grown out of my comfort zone. I've always used MediChecks for myself, for my clients. I know the majority of my friends use it. And I'll have the link for MediChecks in the description below. So unless you have a reason to go elsewhere, I'd recommend going there, picking up a blood test, and obviously that's going to give you the tools you need to have an understanding of where you are prior to supplementing with these drugs. Now, it's important to know, while I'm on the topic of testosterone, that when you're analysing your blood work or selecting your blood test even, don't select total testosterone and or only read the total testosterone segment of that test, because it doesn't tell us enough. We have to consider what happens to that testosterone when it enters the body. So it enters the body and it's either going to get bound to SHBG, so sexual hormone binding globulin, or bound to serum albumin, which means that there's only going to be a small section of that testosterone that's actually freely available, which is what we know as free test, which is the figure that we realistically need to look at in order to get an understanding of how much free testosterone our body's got available to use. Now, there are many, many esters that testosterone comes in. So enanthate, cypionate, propionate, you name it, there's going to be an ester with testosterone. Primarily, I would always recommend looking at something like an enanthate, just because it's that perfect middle ground in terms of injection frequency. You know, you can administer that twice a week and get away with that, no problems at all. You could probably do once a week. I'd just always recommend 2. You shouldn't really need to go any more frequent than twice a week with just the testosterone enanthate only cycle. In terms of dosage, obviously we know that the literature speaks for itself in that more is always better in terms of its return from an anabolism perspective. You know, we are going to build more muscle on more testosterone. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a smarter decision to always take on more. And when we look at it from an efficiency standpoint and a bang for buck standpoint, it's arguably better to start off with a very, very low dose of testosterone, because I'd always argue that there's room to increase, but not necessarily much room to decrease. And I think often you'll surprise yourself with how well you will respond to it. You know, if we take a case study like me, for example, 18 years old, 200 milligrams of testosterone goes in. Blood serum testosterone levels, and again this is total testosterone, but to give you a representation, went from I think 10 or 11 nanomole per litre up to 130 something nanomole per litre off just 200 milligrams. So I am a hyper responder based on average response to a 200 milligram testosterone dosage, but nonetheless you can see the vast increase there just off a relatively reserved dosage. And off the back of that, I always recommend starting somewhere in the realm of, say, 150 to 200 milligrams, and then just titrate up for effect over time if need be. I disagree with the idea of just hammering that androgen pathway with more and more testosterone. I think with the way that the literature is positioned now, and with the amount of knowledge that's freely available on safer use models, we can be much more sensible with our stack design, and we can select a compound from a multitude of different pathways in order to maximize our return with a minimal hammering on any individual pathway, yielding increased side effects per pathway, if that makes sense. So I would always start low, 150 milligram, 200 maybe, and then just assess your blood work 12 or 16 weeks, do another blood test, analyze how you're looking, make a decision as to whether you want to increase the dose, decrease the dose, come off, maintain, add a compound, whatever you choose to do. And then from there, obviously, we've got a much better understanding of how you physically responded, not just what Steve from Reddit said that you're going to respond like. Now, hopefully that gives you a little bit of an introduction to testosterone, guys. These videos aren't intended to be full breakdowns or guidance. This isn't obviously a recommendation. This is just my personal experience. But I hope that it's given you a little bit of an insight into all things testosterone. And we'll see you in the next episode where we take a look at nandrolone.